The Soviet Union in the post-colonial world. Most of the post-war period, Soviet activity in the Third World was cautious and non-revolutionary. For several decades, the USSR took an essentially pragmatic view of its relations with the Third World revolutionary, radical, and liberation movements, since it neither intended nor expected to enlarge the region under communist government beyond the range of Soviet occupation in the West, or the Chinese intervention, which it could not entirely control in the East. Stalin kept Third-world radicals like Nasser and Mossadegh at arm's length, regarding them with suspicion and failing to capitalize on their non-alignment with the West. Khrushchev, in contrast, saw the potential for anti-Western sentiment in Arab nationalist regimes and sought closer ties. The struggle against Molotov, the search for spectacular achievements, led to Khrushchev and his supporters to rediscover the potential of Arab nationalism in the Middle East. On July 1955, immediately after the devastating criticism of Molotov at the party Bellum, the president sent Khrushchev's new favorite Central Committee secretary, Dmitry Shepilov, on a reconnaissance mission to the Middle East. Shepilov met Nasser and invited him to Moscow. He also began to establish friendlier relations with the leaders of other Arab states who refused to join the Western Bloc. Chevrolet came back to Moscow from the Middle East, convinced that the region had great potential for another peace offensive against the Western powers. Andrei Sakharov and other nuclear designers happened to be invited in the Presidium on the day they discussed Chepilov's report. An official explained that the leaders were discussing a decisive change of principle of Soviet policy in the Middle East. From now on, we will support the Arab nationalists. The longer-term target is the destruction of the established relation of the Arabs with Europe and the United States, creation of the oil crisis. This will generate problems for Europe. It will make it more dependent on us. In the midst of strategic statement in Europe and the Far East, these regions provide no outlet for the Kremlin's renewed optimism and ideological romanticism. The consequences of this policy turn were immediate. The language Egyptian Czechoslovakian talks on sale of arms rapidly became to a successful conclusion, and a flood of Soviet-designed Czechoslovak weaponry streamed into Egypt and Syria. Moscow supplied Egypt with 500,000 tons of oil and agreed to provide atomic energy technology, to no avail. Concerned Western and Israeli officials tried to resonate against new Soviet policies, publicly and privately. The struggle between Moscow and the West for the Arab Middle East was the beginning. In the next 2 decades, it will generate an unprecedented arms race in the region and produce three wars. In the immediate future, Moscow will be triumphant and destroy Western plans to contaminate the southern flank of the Soviet Union. At the same time, in the case of the GDR, heavy Soviet investment in its Arab client would turn Egypt and Syria into major assets, similar to East Germany, that the Kremlin could not afford to lose. The Middle Eastern venture became a geopolitical gamble, but it ended as a contributing factor for the Soviet imperial overstretch of the 1970s. Even so, Khrushchev limited itself to the most part to seeking common anti-Western alignment with the existing bourgeois nationalist regimes in the Third World, rather than actively providing revolutionary changes, at least until interventions in Angola and Mozambique in the 1970s. Soviet support for communist revolution in the Third World was generally in response to pressure from the latter. Both sides, Hobsbawm stated, tactically accepted the boundaries of each other's zones of influence, and during the 1950s and 60s, no indigenous revolutionary change appeared on the globe to disturb this balance, except in Cuba. Hobsbawm adds, the revolutions of the 1950s in the Middle East, Egypt in 52 and Iraq in 58, contrary to Western fears, did not change the balance, in spite of providing much scope for USSR diplomatic successes, chiefly because the local regimes eliminated their own communists ruthlessly, but they were influential as in Syria and Iraq. This process continued in the Khrushchev years as a number of homegrown revolutions, in which communist parties played no significant part, came to power under their own steam, notably Cuba in 1959 and Algeria in 1962. African decolonization also brought to power national leaders who asked for nothing better than the title of anti-imperialist, socialist, and friends of the Soviet Union, especially when the latter brought the technical and other aid not tainted by old colonialism. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, and Sekou Touré in Guinea, or Modibo Keïta in Mali, and the tragic Patrice Lumumba in the Belgian Congo, whose murder made him a third world icon and martyr. The USSR renamed the People's Friendship University, established for the Third World students in 1960, Lumumba University. Moscow's sympathies with such new regimes had helped them, though soon abandoning excessive optimism about the new African state. In the East Belgian Congo, it was gave armed support to the Lumumba side against clients or puppets of the USA and the Belgians in the Civil War, with interventions by the military force of the United Nations equally disliked by both superpowers. The follow of the reciprocal granting of independence to those vast colonies, the results were disappointing. When one of the new regimes, Fidel Castro in Cuba, actually declared itself to be officially communist to everyone's surprise, the USSR took it under its wing, but not at the risk of permanently jeopardizing its relation with the USA. Nevertheless, there is no real evidence that it planned to push forward a frontier of communism by the revolution until the middle of the 1970s. Even if the evidence suggests that the USSR made use of favorable conjuncture, they had not set out to create Khrushchev's hopes. Older readers may recall where the capitalists would be buried by the economic superiority of socialism, and the case of Stalinism and Maoism. Indeed, when Soviet leadership and international communist movement was challenged in 1960 by China, not to mention by various dissident Marxists in the name of revolution, Moscow's party in the Third World maintained their chosen policy of studying moderation. And capitalism was not the enemy in such countries, insofar as it existed, but the pre-capitalist local interests and the U.S. imperialism that supported them. Armed struggle was not the way forward, but a broad popular or national front in which the natural bourgeoisie or petty bourgeoisie were allies. In short, Moscow's Third World strategy continued to counterline of the 1930s against all denunciation treason to the cause of the October Revolution. An extreme example is in Japan, where the United Red Army of Japan, half of their members were killed by their own. Like it was basically a cult. The same thing with the Shining Path in Peru, which was basically a terrorist death cult as well. Like most of the third world nationalist leaders that happened during around this time, it made common cause that Castro was initially a billion best towards the local Communist Party, and I quote, "For radical, neither Fidel nor any of his comrades were communists, with two exceptions, his brother and Che Guevara, even claimed to have Marxist sympathies of any kind. In fact, the Cuban Communist Party, the only such mass party that America, apart from the Chilean one, was notably unsympathetic until parts of it joined him rather late in his campaign. Relations between them were distinctly frosty. The U.S. diplomat and policy advisor were constantly debating whether the movement was or was not pro-communist. If it were, the CIA, which had already overthrown a reformed government in Guatemala in 1954, knew what to do, but clearly concluded that it was not. In fact, it's been proven in multiple cases that it was a liberal revolution. However, everything was moving the Fidelist movement in the direction of communism. From the general social revolutionary ideology of those likely undertaking armed insurrections to the passionate anti-communists of the USA in the decades of Senator McCarthy, which automatically inclined to the anti-imperialist Latin rebels to look more kindly on Marx. The global Cold War did the rest. If the new regime antagonized the USA, which was almost certain to do, if only by threatening American investments, it could rely on almost guaranteed sympathies and supports of the USA's great antagonists. Moreover, Fidel's foreign government by informal monologues before millions was not a way to run even a small country or a revolution for any length of time. Even populism needs organization. The Communist Party was the only body in the revolutionary side which could provide him with it. The two needed one another and conversed. However, by March 1960, well before Fidel had discovered that Cuba was to be socialist, he himself was a communist, though very much of his own manner. The USA decided to treat him as such, and the CIA was ordered to arrange for his overthrow. In fact, before that, he wanted to make allies with the United States, but rejected, even though he praised Abraham Lincoln as his hero, as admirer. But because of that, he joined the Soviet Union for opportunistic reasons. The Soviet model of development encouraged authoritarian, bureaucratic regimes in the Third World. Conversely, the ideologies, the programs, even the methods and forms of political organization which inspired the emancipation of dependent countries from dependency, backwards ones from backwardness, were Western liberal social communists and or nationalist secularists and suspicious of clericalism, using the evidence developed that for the purpose of public life in the bourgeois society, press, public meetings, parties, mass campaigns, and even when the discourse adopted was and had to be in the religious vocabulary uses by the masses. What this meant was that the history of the makers of the third world transformations of this century is the history of elite minorities, and sometimes relative minutes ones, for quite apart from the absence of institutions of democratic politics almost everywhere. Only a tiny strata possessed the requisite knowledge and education, or even elementary literacy. None of this was the westernizing elite necessarily accept all the values of state and culture they took as their models. Their personal views might range from 100% assimilationist to a deep distrust of the West, combined with the conviction that only by adopting its innovation could the specific values of the native civilization be preserved or restored. The object of the most wholehearted and successful project of modernization. Japan said the Meiji Restoration was not to the westernize, but on the contrary to make traditional Japan viable. In the same way, the Third World activists read into the ideologies and progress they made their own was not much of a ostensible text as their own subtext. Thus, in the period of independence, socialism, i.e., the Soviet version, excuse me, appealed to decolonized governments, not only because of the cause of anti-imperialism had always belonged to the metropolitan left, but even more because they saw the USSR as the model for overcoming backwardness by means of planned industrialization, a metaphor more urgent to serve to them the emancipation of whatever could be described in the country as the proletariat. Similar, while the Brazilian Communist Party never wavered in its commitment to Marxism, a particular kind of developmental nationalism became a fundamental ingredient in the party policy from the early 1930s, even when conflicted with labor interests considered separate from others. Nevertheless, whatever the conscious or unconscious objectives of those who shaped the history of the backward world, modernization, that is to say, the imitation of Western models, was a necessary and indispensable way to achieve them. And like I said earlier, there are many cases where the USSR had joined reactionary forces, like, for example, the Free State of Women, who was considered the first Marxist state, and it was the quote unquote the only left wing fascist slash anarcho fascist, you know, ever put in practice, even though it has the word anarcho, they still believe in hierarchy. It was controlled by a rapist gang, and the only country that recognized the Free State of Women was the Soviet Union under Lenin. And the same thing with the former communist factions within the Zionist movement joined forces with the Nazis to do the transfer agreement. And 1 month after Israel independence, they almost broke into a civil war among the fascist faction, the Irgun, and the various socialist groups in the Harbin, in the Haragane factions. And the Soviet Union has supported Israel in its early years, despite the fact they committed genocide, also known as the Nakba, or when the French communists approved the shelling and the bombing of Vietnamese communists starting the Vietnam War, or the Socialist Party of Spain creating death squads to suppress the independence movement of Catalan and Basque regions. We could keep going with this over and over and over. Or during the May 68 revolution in France, the French communist parties and other similar groups joined forces with the bourgeois capitalists to suppress the movement, and which they pretty much succeeded. The Soviet Union took cautious approach to actual communist movements in the Third World, attempting to be restraining influence at least much as a support. Previously, the Soviet leadership had not ascribed any geopolitical importance to Vietnam and Indochina. They sought in vain to dissuade Hanoi from starting a war against the South. They feared historian Ilian Gautek could prove that this war would be an imperative to the process of the entente with the United States and its allies, the direct U.S. intervention. However, forces to the Politburo's hand, now the ideological code for fraternal duty prevails. In February 1965, trip to Hanoi, Korskin tried and failed to dissuade North Vietnam from a full-scale war against the United States. Even in the case of Cuba's mid-1960 adventures in the former Portuguese colonies in Southern Africa, Yuri Atrapov confined after the fact that veteran diplomat Oleg Troyanovsky, the Soviets were dragged into Africa against their best interests. The Soviet leadership itself was incapable of both schemes and initiatives. It took all the dynamic and ideological motivation players to drag the Soviet leaders into African gambit, including Angola's Agostino Neto and Ethiopia's Mengistu Haile Mariam, but especially Fidel Castro and his revolutionary colleagues in Cuba. Contrary to U.S. belief, the Cuban leaders were not mere puppets or surrogates of Moscow. Since the 1960s, Fidel and Raul Castro and Che Guevara, until his death in 1967, had and other Cuban revolutionaries had supported revolutionary guerrilla operations in Algeria, Zaire, the Congo, the Brazzaville, and Guinea-Bissau. Flight of the United States from Vietnam in 1975 was Cuba's belief a chance for another round of anti-imperial struggle in sub-Saharan Africa. According to one version, Gromyko and Kreshko and Antropov recommended that the Politburo send modest non-military assistance to the MPLA, but cautioned against the direct involvement of the Angola Civil War. A few days later, however, the International Department transmitted the Angola request for arms to the Politburo. After briefly hesitating, the same Troika reversed its position and supported the request. In early December 1974, immediately after the Vladivostok summit, the pipeline for military assistance was opened. This reversal may be the result of lobbying by Soviet and Cuban friends of NATO, as well as bureaucratic long growing in the absence of previous direct involvement. 2 weeks after the signing of the final act in Helsinki, Castro sent Kremlin a plan to transport Cuban regular army units to Angola. At the time, President flatly refused to expand Soviet military assistance in Angola or to transport Cubans there. Yet by November, possibly the first Cuban combat troops were fighting on the side of the MPLA. Kornienko later asserted the Cubans outfoxed the Soviet military representatives in Cuba, making them believe they had authorized from the Kremlin to fly them across the ocean. Krumkio, Kreshko, and Antropov were surprised. They agreed the Cuban movement would lead to a sharp American reaction, complications for the Lieutenant, and even tensions around Cuba itself. Meanwhile, the Cubans had already begun Operation Carlota to cite the MPLA. What makes this story even more puzzling is the total absence of evidence coming from the Cuban archives in Havana. 2 years earlier, Crespo had done nothing to assist the collapsing socialist government of Salvador Allende in Chile and rejected his plea for loans. In fact, China under Mao Zedong supported the fascist Pinochet era of Chile instead of Salvador Allende. And they also voted against Puerto Rican independence. Again, Maoist China. And they also, again in Maoist China, supported apartheid South Africa. So again, we just keep going with this nonsense over and over and over again. The increased integration of the USSR into a capitalist world order, one might even argue that the USSR fell behind in its struggle to offer a rival model of economic development. It went beyond collaborative competition and was to some extent actually integrated into capitalist world economy. In the immediate post-World War II period, the world communist movement lived in hope, and many in Western ruling circles in fear that the USSR would be competitive with the West in terms of economic growth. Only in the 1960s did it become clear that this had been an illusion. The idea of international politics is a struggle between two social systems represented by two superpowers become increasingly unrealistic. By the 1980s, it has little relevance to international politics as a crusade. The third world countries believe only public action could lift their economies out of backwardness and dependency. In the decolonized world, following the inspiration of the Soviet Union, they will see the way forward is socialism. The Soviet Union as a newly extended family, believing in nothing but central planning. The Soviet Union was progressively pigeonholed in what was essentially a third-world export-oriented model in the International Division of Labor. And the irony, even though the U.S. government has repeatedly cried that they are against the centralized central planning and nationalization, even though they did that in the space race for NASA, and they nationalized many things like the U.S. Postal Service, PBS, NPR, couple of train stations, etc. It went full central planning and nationalization during World War I and World War II, which helped them their logistic administration ability to win the war. The Soviet Union was progressive if they keep doing this for the third world. So far from becoming one of the industrial giants of world trade, the USSR appeared to be internationally regressive. In the 1960s, its major exports had been machinery, equipment, means of transport, and metals or metal articles. By 1985, it relied on its exports primarily 53% on energy, oil, and gas. Conversely, almost 60% is import consistently on machinery, metals, and etc., and industrial consumable articles. It had become something like an energy production colony of more advanced industrial economies. In practice, largely its own Western satellites, notably Czechoslovakia and the German Democratic Republic, whose industry could rely on unlimited and undemanding market of the USSR without doing so much to improve their own deficiencies. The trouble for really existing socialism in Europe was that, unlike the interwar USSR, which was virtually outside of the world economy and therefore immune to the Great Slump, now quote unquote socialism was increasingly involved in it and therefore not immune to the shocks of the 1970s. It's an irony of history that the real socialist economies of Europe and the USSR, as well as parts of the third world, became real victims of the most post-Golden Age crisis of the global capitalist economy, where the development market economies, though shaken, made their way through the difficult years without major trouble. One of them is Yugoslavia, who had a socialist market model, even though they did loans and they also had private property, and it was basically no different than the capitalist approach to free markets. At least until the early 1990s. Until then, some indeed, like Germany and Japan, barely faltered in their forward march. Real socialism, however, now confronted not only its own increasing insuperable systematic problems, but also those of changing and problematic world economy into which it was increasingly integrated. For oil producers, on whom the USSR happened to be one of the most important, if the oil crisis turned black liquid into gold. It was like the guaranteed weekly winning ticket to the lottery. The millions simply rolled into effort, postponing the need for economic reforms and increasingly embedding the USSR to pay for its rapidly growing imports from the capitalist West. With export as the energy. Between 1970 to 1980, Soviet exports to the development market economy rose from just 19% of total exports to 32%. And again, the Soviet Union, because of its very credit control, was against actual innovation. For example, the idea of the internet was first developed by a Soviet scientist in the 50s, but they rejected it because it was a decentralized, horizontal approach, very non hierarchical, and it was basically, in principle, the principles of anarchism, anarchist communism, which the internet today still, for the most part, functions under the principle of anarchist communism in its structure of its functioning. But the Soviet Union rejected it because Stalin would not have a grab of power because of it. The West's vision of the post-war order, my mistake, the basic doctrine behind America's vision of post-war world was stated by Cordell Hull as early as 1935. It's the collapse of the world structure, the development of isolated economy that is let loose the fear which now grips every nation and which threatens the peace of the world. Formed from mere idealistic vision by intellectual committee, it reflected especially economic interests. In 1936, Assistant Secretary of State Francis Sierra, chairman of Roosevelt Executive Committee on Commercial Policy, warned unless we can export and well abroad our surplus production, we must face a violent disclosure of our whole domestic economy. These views mounted to a restatement of what had been a general American view of things, with William Appleman William Cole's open door empire. Since the beginning of the 20th century, the Roosevelt administration saw the guarantee of American access to foreign markets as vital to ending the Depression and the threat of eternal upheaval that went along with it. FDR's ongoing policy of open door empire, confronted with the withdrawal of major areas from the world market by other darker policies of Great Eastern Asian co-prosperity sphere and fortress empire, led directly to American entry into World War II. The open door empire ideology reflected the grand area concept formulated by State Department planners in the period immediately leading up to American entry into the Second World War. On September 12, 1939, the State Department and the Council of Foreign Relations began a joint planning project to analyze various long-term problems of the war and to plan post-war order. Its conclusion waited to be presented as a recommendation to the Department of State and President Roosevelt. After the fall of France, policy planners were horrified at the possibility that Germany might defeat Britain, capture some portion of its fleet, and cut off the empire from U.S. commerce. Assistant Secretary of State Burkett Long warned that every commercial order would be routed to Berlin and fail somewhere in Europe rather than in the United States, resulting in failing prices and declining profits here and lowering on standards of living with the consequent social and political disturbance. The economic and social groups, one of the project's five study groups, accordingly began to study a U.S. dependence on world markets and resources, and the viability of economic autarky within the Western Hemisphere, and the end of the war cut the U.S. off from traditional sphere of interest. The group divided the world into major blocks and created an input-output analysis of the production and trade of each block and its dependency on outside trade. It found that the Western Hemisphere could not be viable on its own. The United States required at least a large economic bloc of the Western Hemisphere, the British Empire in the Far East, together compromising what was later called the Grand Area, and on October 19, 1940, the study group issued its conclusion and memorandum EB-19, arguing need to integrate the non-German world under U.S. economy leadership. Meanwhile, increasing portions of Far East would be integrated into Japan's greater East Asian prosperity sphere. Japan envisioned the latter as its own version of the Grand Area, eventually encompassing Indochina, Burma, Thailand, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines, in addition to the area already occupied areas of Korea, Manchuria, and northern China. Japan considered control of this area necessary for economic self-sufficiency, particularly in raw materials. The Economy and Financial Group met on November 23rd to consider measures to prevent Japan from conquering Southeast Asia and shutting out the U.S. On December 14th, all five study groups met with the State Department. Representatives issued a memorandum to Cortel Hoare and FDR, dated January 15, 1941, stated that it was essential for the U.S. to maintain access to the raw materials of the Philippines, Malaysia, and Dutch East Indies. It proposed aid to China to tame down Japanese forces, air and naval assistance to the defense of Southwest Asia, and an embargo on war on material to Japan. Within 6 months, the United States implemented its recommendations of aid to China and an embargo against Japan, beginning the chain of events that led to war. Cortel Hall, in May 1941, stated America's economic aim for post-war world in terms were classic open-door empire. I quote, extreme nationalism could not be expressed in excess trade restrictions after the war. Non-discrimination in international commercial relations must be the rule. A raw material supply must be available to all nations without discrimination, including the careful limitation on commodity agreements affecting the consumer nations such as the United States. Lastly, in regards to the reconstruction of world finance, the institution and arrangement of international finance must be set up in their land to an essential enterprise and continued development of all countries, to permit the payment through cross-asset trade consistent with the welfare of all countries. End quote. In July 1942, public address on economic war aims Hall elaborated its earlier vision. The four required American leadership in the world economy, the opposition of economic nationalism or new internationalism, which many Americans allies feared was synonymous with the American hegemony over the world economy. To the colonial nations, Hall's often repeated words convey undertow of a new colonialism. Through international investment, capital must be made available for the sound development of latent natural resources and produce capacity in global undertaking strokes on many allies as potential damaging to their interests. Leadership towards a new system of international relations in trade and other economic affairs would devolve very largely upon the United States because of our great economic strength. We should assume this leadership and the responsibility that goes with it, primarily for reasons of pure national self-interest. End quote. The proper access to foreign markets and resources was central to U.S. policy planning for post-World War. Given the structural imperatives of export-dependent monopoly capitalism, the threat of post-war depression was real. Already during the Great Depression of the 1930s, the American economy was unable to operate at a level of output needed to fully utilize its production capacity. Wartime industrial expansion exacerbated this problem immensely by vastly expanding plant equipment at taxpayers' expenses. The domestic market was simply capable of serving sufficient output to keep the wheels of industry turning. Fears of post-war depression, when military preoccupied orders ceased and service members were thrown back to the civilian job market, weighed heavily on U.S. leadership. A world free from restrictions of the exports of both American capital and American goods by imperial trading blocs of autocratic arrangements by regional power was therefore very much a matter of national self-interest from the capitalist perspective of its policymakers. In 1944, in November, in an address to the Congressional Committee on Postwar Economic Policy and Planning, Dean Acheson warned the consequences if the war to be followed by a slide back into depression, and I quote, it seemed clear that we are in for a bad time, so far as the economy and social position of the country is concerned. We cannot go through another 10 years like the 10 years at the end of the 20th century at the beginning of the 30s without having the most far-reaching consequences of our economic and social system. End quote. The problem was markets, not production. You don't have a problem of production. The important thing is markets. We had to go to see what the country produces use and is sold on the financial arrangement which makes its production possible. Short of the introduction of command economy with controls over income and distribution to ensure the domestic consumption of all that was produced, the only way to achieve full output and full employment was through access to foreign markets. Based on their expenses of depression, along with the resulting revolutionary and military upheavals of the 30s, American leadership wished above all to prevent recurrence. They did not simply wish to repair the pre-war economy, but to reconstruct it anew. There was a remarkable unanimity in Washington in this objective, and it was far the most extensively discussed peace aim, surprising any other in the level of planning and thought given into it. The American leadership will achieve this by creating a rational post-war global political and economic order, In the last analysis, the solution to the world's political problems could be found in rationally ordered world economy, and this kind of assumption colored the United States' response to specific problems in Europe, Asia, and Latin America continuously during World War II and thereafter. The resulting policy vision entails securing global grand area through institutional global economic governance. The United States, according to planning in post-war reconstruction and American dominant world order even before it entered the war, the CFR Memorandum EB-34, dated July 24, 1941, stressed the importance of the Grand Area structure of reorganizing the post-war, and especially integrating the European economies under American leadership. And in the event of U.S.-British victory, integration requires a conscious the program of broadly conceived measures for securing the full use of economic resources of the whole area. It followed up on an earlier memorandum of July 10. It recommended the creation of global financial institutions to destabilize currencies and promote investments in development backwards areas, what eventually became the Bretton Woods Institution. The Grand Area had to be protected above all from defection from within by any power which sought to remove its resources and markets for integration global economy. This vision of free world under U.S. leadership of any power which threatened U.S. hegemony as an aggressor to be contained. Considerably predate the emergence of the USSR as a Pacific power playing the aggressor's role. Started very early in the war, policy planner unabashedly defined U.S. global hegemony as the central war aim. On December 15, 1941, Isaiah Bowman, head of both the CRV and the Territorial Study Group, wrote in a Foreign Affairs editor, Hamilton Fish Armstrong, the United States had to think of world organization in a French way, and refrain from throwing away its arsenal at the moment of victory. It must accept world responsibility. The measure of our victory will be measure of our domination after victory. On January 16, 1942, Bowman stated in a memorandum that the U.S. after victory would have to adopt a broader vision of security interest to include areas strategically necessary for world control. So the United States already saw its future hegemony over other Western powers, and more particularly the Third World, as necessity at the time when the day-to-day survival of the Soviet Union was in grave doubt, let alone any future bipolar competition with nuclear-armed communist superpower. Norman Davis, chairman of the Security Subcommittee of the State Department Advisory Committee on Post-War Foreign Relations and also CRP, stated in the meeting of the committee on May 6, 1942, the British Empire, as it existed in the past, will never reappear, and the United States might have to take his place. In the same meeting, General George V. Strachan, who had worked on the State Department CFE War Peace Studies project in 1940, advocated a mental view towards world settlement would enable us to impose our own terms, amounting perhaps to a Pax Americana. The first requirement for post-war economic order was a guarantee of access to raw materials in the Third World. Charles P. Taft, director of the State Department Office of Wartime Economic Affairs, predicted in May 1944 that the most metals and oil will eventually have to be imported. It was therefore necessary to export goods and capital for which the developing world will play only in raw material export. This required in turn the new vision of the open door, not as before merely priority of all foreign interests with the most favored nation, but also priority of foreign with domestic interests. This meant no protection, no import substitution at all for promoting third world industrialization. The second requirement was to expand foreign market to absorb increased output or prevent a post-war depression. The war produced broad and in April 1944 estimated that victory in Europe would release 2 million soldiers and 3.5 to 4 million civilian workers from employment and reduce demand for industrial output by $27 billion. That meant replacing the lost war output with an enormous increase in consumer goods production. And as Harry Hawkins, director of the State Department Office of Economic Affairs, explained, the American domestic market can't be absorbed all the production indefinitely. There won't be any question about our needing greatly increased foreign markets. Finally, post-war order required foreign outlets for America's surplus capital. In an economy with such high levels of existing fixed capital and high capital labor ratios, further impulse a capital have reached to the point of diminishing returns. The economy simply will not absorb large numbers of additional investment for any prospect of decent returns. Compound the problem, there was an enormous glut of wartime savings, which will not be profitably invested in domestic interests. Dean Acheson later looked back nostalgically in the British colonial system of the 19th century, which enabled Britain to export capital and maintain domestic political stability. And I quote, a system for the export capital much greater than our hand-to-mouth efforts is necessary. The system had been destroyed, which expanded the power of Western Europe and permanent industrial development in societies in which individual liberties survived. End quote. American plans for post-World War came into direct conflict with those of its British allies. In the American vision, a unified world market free of regional economic bloc was to be enforced by the United States as a hegemonic global power. The United States determined to oppose its other allies, creating blocs and spheres of interest. They also shaped the future of the United Nations in the manner that acknowledged not just great power among other members of the Security Council, but also the distinctive role of the United States as the most powerful nation on earth. In contrast, the American vision of a single global economic order and presumably enforced by the United States as senior partner in the global concern with the United Nations is a barely disguised glove of the American fist. Britain envisioned a post-World War a regional blocs, including its own imperial trade preference and sterling monetary bloc, and a Western European economic and security bloc under British leadership, an arrangement which would leave England with the Empire in a predominant position in a united Europe. This was the main source of friction between the Americans and British during the war. The American pressure, reinforced by the leverage of land-based land lease, was sufficient great to accept British assent to vague terms of the Article 4 of the Atlantic Charter. They will endeavor with due respect for the existing obligation to further the enjoyment by all states of access on equal terms to the trade and to the raw materials of the world which are needed for their economic prosperity, but during the war, the U.S. was still unable to obtain British ratification of sterling bloc or of imperial preferences. With the end of the war in Europe and the termination on Lend-Lease, the rapid deterioration of the British financial situation, and the desperation for American financial system put an end to the struggle on American terms. And even though those who separate from the Soviet Union, like China under Mao Zedong, is not any better. China under Mao Zedong never was on the side of the people. They temporarily banned rock music and boxing. They joined forces with the Kuomintang on multiple occasions, advocated for closer alliance with the Kuomintang, supported Chiang Kai-shek during the program of the bourgeois nationalist Sun Yat-sen. And this is why Marxism, not just Maoism, is counter-revolutionary in practice. Like for example, in Laos, capitalist reforms, many people in countryside are losing their lands, or the Wild State using military dictatorship, or Cuba shifting to private capitalism. 1 in 10 Cubans are in private enterprises, or Vietnam's wealth gap slash billionaires, or if the homophobia, Vietnam has the fastest growing ultra rich population in the world, or North Korea's Juche philosophy, which is a race based nationalism founded on Japanese fascism with a mix of foreign markets and national capitalism or Vietnamese killing other communists with the French, or China betraying Vietnam during the Vietnam War, or China joined the U.S. with the support of Pakistani dictator Javad Khan, or Maoist China supporting Pinochet, or supported the South African invasion of the Soviet Angola, or you know, or joined forces with the Portuguese fascist dictatorship in the 1970s or wanted to make NATO stronger against the Soviets, supported the Filipino fascist dictator Fernando Marcos, and in his attempt to crush Maoist guerrilla movements in that country, or the leading Italian government criminalizing all left groups as terrorists actively held by the government in suppression of far left groups after the Red Brigade is kidnapped and executed the politician Aldo Moro in spring 1978 or in more recent time using cheap labor for Amazon, or Bitcoin, which is a primary mine in China and Russia, or other capitalist corporations, or free zones where workers can earn tax-free salaries and overall killing any chance of socialism. You know, and look at China. Even after Mao Zedong reign, it still follow his authoritarian tendencies. For example, many anarchists and Maoists are forced to go underground, and people who subscribe to Marxism, like Yu Xin, who fights for labor rights and women's rights, gets disappeared because it's illegal to have independent unions, or her protest to poor labor conditions and a lack of social welfare in the Guangdong model. China is a capitalist oppressing Marxists, closed down Maoist websites, prohibit Marxist debates in universities. Despite Xi Jinping's Maoist rhetoric, 3/3 of employment is given to the private sector, with the capitalist system so bad that half of all female suicides in the world are from rural China. Financial surveillance in China's social credit system. If the or China backing the genocidal regime of the Khartoum or building the Luna airport in exchange for 10,000 barrels of crude oil a day, or as the 2020 strikes are illegal, or the top 20% households hold 42% of total urban incomes, while the poorest 20% receive just 6%. Chinese helicopter guns have been used against civilians in Darfur, or communication or information, or Mao ordered the beheading of true anarchists, Quan Ai and Pan Quan, or trained Sri Lankan soldiers that did the Talmi genocide, or concentration camps against the Uyghur people, doing cultural genocide. Silence any Marxists who criticize bureaucratic supports, or supporting the Khmer Rouge, or supporting the Sudan regime from 2003 to 2018, or using the military to oppress workers and defending Taiwanese capitalist businesses, or removing the right to secession in 1949, despite promoting secession in 1931. Or in housing, in second-tier cities, the price is about $1,500 per square meter on average, while the average salary for assembly worker are $500 a month. Despite Xi Jinping praising the economic Thomas Piketty, his law against work capital ideology is banned in China for critiquing China's wealth gap, ban on knowledge of class antagonism, Chinese and acknowledging that China is capitalism, or metropolitan heavy corporations join the World Trade Organization, admitting there is a market capitalist system. Commodity has been universalized using supply chains, food, housing, education, transportation, healthcare, leisure, socialization is not guaranteed except for the rich, which China has more billionaires than the United States and India combined. 300 million migrant workers are second-class citizens in their own country. By the system of household registrations, workers which they leave their original location that are forsaking any right to stay subsidized reproduction. If the and workers without contract don't have legal protection, thus worse labor rights. Social insurance or health, if the insurance or pensions or work injury or unemployment or birth insurance are employee based, and people in the urban sector are richer, have more rights. The military brutally put down people's riots against police brutality. In 2018, 153 richest people in central government body had a combined wealth of $650 billion, putting a statue of Confucius in Tiananmen Square. Despite being the richest country in the world at $600 million in net network, Chinese live off $141.45 a month. Or if the calling anybody who supports Taiwan, it doesn't matter if they're socialists and support Taiwan independence, or others are grouped as anarchists, regardless what their ideology is. Or in 2008, when activists called for returning power to the people at an academic conference, the government declared the statement, returning power to the people, as the evil path of anarchism. Or in 1989, when the Secretary General and CPC declared are opposing those who advocate ultra democracy and anarchism, or the CPC declared the activists in Tiananmen Square in 1989 for promoting of anarchist thinking. And the Hugo system is the same as the WIC in the US. When Xi Jinping is in power, they remove term limits, which means presidents are more accurately dictator for life, like Simon Bolivar or Julius Caesar. There's a reason why we must reject hierarchy, centralized authority, or all forms of states, because the worst case scenario is because of death code, like the shiny path in Peru, or the if the workers' institution of Marx and Lenin and Mao Zedong in England, a literal religious group. They were the leader, Aravindan Balakrishna, took seven members, all women, as his wives, treated them like slaves, and this is why we must abolish all hierarchies. And there's no actual democratic decision making in China during Mao Zedong's time and today under Xi Jinping. China, where party insiders elect higher positions instead of making them electable by the people, because Mao and the CCP assume the masses are stupid and will not know politics. Thus, let's keep the state under direct influence where today is a mixed economy, wants to keep growing economically and making businesses easier by reducing workers' rights, makes exceptions for big corporations, let capital to go in there for their interests, which right now, if by 2078 it doesn't become a socialist, it will become what is the United States right now. This right-wing accelerationist, neo-Nazi monarchist, and narco-capitalist hell. Various cases during history during Mao Zedong's era and after of committing cultural genocides, Basically, anybody who is non-Chinese are forced to speak English to be part of their culture. Like current conflicts over Mongolian language in schools or ethnic cleansing policies in Tibet, or the Chinese government joined sides with the Kingdom of Nepal, giving arms to them against the Maoist Party of Nepal during the Nepal Civil War, or supporting the apartheid Israel. Because China is the second largest the arms weapon dealer to Israel. It suppressed the Palestinian independence movement, or adopting the gig economy with L.me supervisor, Amini is making conditions more difficult for the workers, having their own gulas called the laugia, for the mass killing of landlords, which, that's supposed to be a good thing for more socialists, but it just maintained the system, just replace a new class with another, which result of spontaneous killing by peasants, which Mao supported as a hatred developed over centuries. Why should the landlords of all kill, rob, and torture peasants, but the current system still have wage slavery, privatization, and triumphs controlling certain sectors? Great Leap Forward was a giant bureaucratic disaster where the people were not in charge, but instead a central authority where a select few were in charge, and the people had no say in the decision-making process. And the Great Famine was caused by 30% natural disaster and 70% to bad policy, a failure of democratic centralism, where the people had no say in the matter to anything. And Lenin, or during the Soviet Union, Lenin had recruited many of the Tsarist people in their government. If the capitalism means the state's the new bug where people did not exercise power, if the Bolshevik used members of the old Tsarist regime in their ranks. In 1922, Lenin admitted the state apparatus as borrowed from Tsarism, or like in China was also a counter-revolutionary movement, with Mao Zedong's party that in the end of 1926, only 66% of the members of the CCP were workers, but every year the working people were virtually non-existent during Mao's reign. In September 1930, only 1.6% of the members were workers. During the Civil War, Li Bao and Chute made proclamations that capitalist businesses, police, and Kumite officials remained their position and stay in their post to keep order. Or in Cuba, where Castro in 1958 and his party was not only a liberal middle class movement, but had no plans for nationalizing foreign investment. And I quote, "We are not opposed to private investment." In Cuba they still use the US dollar, which is dominated by former white Cuban elites, creating wage gap and racism. The state decides which is dominated by the former white Cuban elite. Este, they say your future for job and you have no autonomy. Este, or under March, China did various imperialism methods, like taking control of Tibet, where Chinese government led military support for Sri Lanka state against the Chalkiyas uprising to oppose the independence of Bangladesh from Pakistan, in order to avoid formation for a Soviet-oriented state to its west, or recognize the new Pinochet regime after the Soviet-oriented Atlantic government was overthrown in a coup, or support the UNITA, an Angola political party also backed by US, and the apartheid regime in South Africa. We'll see you on part 3.